All right, we've gone all around and back again. Back to chest, which is honestly one of my favorite lifts still. There's always something about just throwing around weight on the bench, or even if you're just doing incline dumbbells, or even Smith machine. It's fun. It's a good workout to be doing, and I enjoy it. You know, I remember when I first started, even when I was just really weak, just being able to get a bench PR, it did really feel good. But that's another thing too. Something I've realized is that pretty much at no time since I've started lifting have I really gone for a 1 rep max. I remember going with my buddy to get a 1 rep max for 135 when I first bench a plate, which is a special moment. And that was about it. I've had little occasional things where I've tested my bench, but most of the time I'm more like, testing my max on like 8 reps, 10 reps. I've never really liked maxing all the way out. And, there's nothing against it, of course, because, it's a test of strength and it's pretty kick-ass when you do it. But in what I'm trying to do, I don't really see a point to constantly testing your 1 rep max. Because if you think about it, you're a bodybuilder. You're trying to build the biggest, the most, symmetrical looking muscles you can. And what you're trying to do is, you're trying to get that muscle to failure, and you're training hard, but when you're going for 1 rep maxes, that's usually when a pec tear happens. That's usually when you blow out something in your back, tear something in your leg. It's when we're at this absolute limit, that oftentimes the weight becomes too much if you just can't handle it. And it's not necessarily that your muscles can't handle it, your tendons might go out, How many times have you seen a guy rupture his patella going for a heavy ass squat? And I'm not saying you shouldn't train hard, because if you can get that feeling with lighter weight, just do more reps. Or like, I love to hear Lee Haney talk, because what he would do is go ahead, if he was doing squats, he'd hit the leg curls and the quad extensions first. He'd be tired, and he'd still be, repping out 405 because he's Lee Haney. But he was, not repping out as much as he had to, because it just made it heavier. He was working on his isolated lifts and then his compound lifts. And that's not to say the isolated lifts are more important. That's to say him pre-exhausting his legs allowed him to train still at that hard level of intensity, but minimizing the risk of injury because he was taking hundreds of pounds off the squat. You're achieving the same thing while using much less weight and being a lot more safe with it. And in my opinion, I think that's probably the way to go, to always try and, get 8 rep maxes instead of, 1 rep. I've never really gone below 5 or 4, because that's just not, I never really liked it. If you're a power lifter, that's one thing. You're training to try and get that one big lifting competition. You're trying to go up, 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 425, 450, 475, and you're training for that. You're training for the pause at the bottom of the bench, and you're training to, get all the white lights on so you can get your depth on squat, but that's not what we're trying to achieve here. So I think train smarter, not necessarily harder. You want to train hard, but don't train as heavy if you don't have to. So, gonna hit some bench today, gonna hit some incline, some shoulder work probably, and we'll just see how that goes. Well, today was a better bench session than the last time, so that's all you can take. You know, last time I got 8, 8, and 7 in terms of my bench. Now I've got 9, 9, 7. So that's an improvement. But you know, still, instead of working with the 60s or 70s, it's the 50s, and then the ones I was showing nearing failure. My last 2 sets, I could only get 6 on 50. Dropped it to 45 just to get a little more out. Still only 6, and it does suck, but it's improvement from the last day of the cut. Sometimes you're feeling it, sometimes you're not, especially you're not as carved up as you usually are. You're not in a fed state, but I'm making small improvements with lighter weight, and I'm pushing myself as hard as I can to failure, and that's what you want to do on a cut. I'm making somewhat progress, and I've lost 10 pounds. Okay, some of it's muscle, some of it's water, some of it's fat. But the point being, I'm not carved up, I'm lighter, but I'm lifting, I'm getting a little better. Not in terms of hitting PRs, but I'm lifting more than I was. And that's the important thing to keep track of, trying to push yourself and keep as much of your strength as you can, because you're going to have a bit of a drop off as soon as you start cutting, because eventually you're going to lose all those glycogen stores in your muscle, and it's just going to be so much harder to put out effort. Instead of having a little more sustained energy because you're in a fed state, you got a little bit of you got more at the beginning, and then you kind of taper off and it gets a little worse. But I'm feeling good, and I don't think that pushing hard is going to result in any injury. It would be foolishness if I were to, ignore my body. I think that's the most important thing that you have to do, and that's just listen to your body. Because, it's oftentimes when you're feeling the best that you hurt yourself because you think you can do more. But, sometimes if your warm-up feels heavy, maybe make it more of a, higher rep day. If you push too hard and then you hurt yourself, well, your progress is tanked for however long the injury takes to heal, and it gets to the point where you just have to realize sometimes you have to take a little bit of a step back and work on maybe higher reps rather than, heavier weight. I'll alternate between, say 5 reps, more of a strength-based day to, anywhere between 8 to 12. I think that's a sweet spot. Not going too low, but not going too high. Still pushing myself and just maintaining that good form. I'm feeling quite good, and I don't think I've lost as much strength as I did on my last cut. This is going to obviously get a lot harder, and I'm getting flatter. I can feel it, and I can see it, especially in the mornings. But, that's what I'm working towards the whole time, and it's a little grindy, and it's a little annoying at times, but the results are going to be speaking for themselves. I can feel it, and I can see it a little bit, so just gonna have to keep going. Tomorrow's leg day, and I'm thinking of adding in some squats. Add a little bit of a quad focus, light obviously, to minimize the stress on my back, but we'll just see how I feel tomorrow. That's, I think, how you should play it. Play it by ear, and just push as hard as you can for that day. All right, so legs tomorrow, and a little bit more cardio for me today. That's all.